So right now, so Matt has joined. So maybe you can tell us a few words about yourself, and then we start with questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexi. And yeah, sorry if I missed something when I joined the call. My headphones weren't working for the first couple seconds. But yeah, it's been awesome to create some content for Data Talks Club. It's been really fun getting to engage with some members of the community in the Slack channel. I think everybody seems to be appreciating things, and I found it really fun to build the course. So um, obviously, if there are any follow-up questions from what we discuss here, I'm happy to jump in and answer them in the Slack. But otherwise, I'm just really grateful to be working with Data Talks Club and being able to share some stuff with you guys. So
Yeah, thanks for being with us. So I am going to share my screen again, and I'm going to go to this screen. So this is the link I shared in Telegram, and it's also pinned in the live chat. So for all the questions you have, you can use that link, and we will, um, yeah, answer these questions. And before that, actually, one question that I see very often appearing in Slack is when I submit my homework, and in the homework, we ask people to provide the homework URL, which is a GitHub repo where all the code that was created for completing the homework should be stored, right? So what's the right way of actually saving the Mage project to a Git repo?
yeah, so the way that the projects are configured, I left a git ignore file in all of the templates, so you don't need to worry about accidentally committing credentials or anything. And Mage it functions entirely as code, right? And so anything that you do in Docker, that you do in the actual Mage interface, is saved as a file in Mage. So it should be as simple as you know typing in git init and then creating a repo and pushing it to some GitHub repo, and that'll save all of the code that you created.
Mhm. So do you understand correctly that we take this code, this repo, and base what we do on that repo, right? And then we can just commit. So essentially, what it means, we just copy paste things from this to our repo, and
Yeah, so
then
if
we create new files, and then we just commit these new files.
For sure. So if you pull down this repo, which the sort of course walks you through the steps, right? Like git clone mage zoom camp, right, is going to pull that onto your computer. And then when you run Docker compose up, which starts this repo, it creates all of the infrastructure of the mage project. So all these files are going to get populated. Then as you add blocks, as you add pipelines in the UI, those are persisted, they're saved to actual Python files on your local machine. So if you run like a git commit, it's going to be saved to whatever Git repo you created, and you should be able to submit it pretty easily.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to walk through that in further detail if that's confusing.
Mm, I don't know if somebody finds it confusing, maybe just write in live chat because we
For sure.
have a lot of other questions. Um, yeah, so let's start with these questions. How can I modify write code for blocks using VS Code instead of using the web UI for Mage?
So this should be as simple as opening the folder in VS Code and changing the files. Personally, I've never seen permissions issues. If you could share, I mean, if this user could share a bit about the permissions issues that we're getting, I'd be happy to help debug that. But I haven't actually seen that
Mhm.
issue before.
I think if you run it on Linux and by default you run Docker as root, right? And then everything that you create inside the container and mount to the local file system will be owned by root,
Mm.
right? And that could create some issues. So we also had this issue in the module number 1, where Postgres would create a folder. And if you run this on Linux, this folder is owned by a root. So then you need to either run the Docker command as a user, um, as you, right? Or do some stuff with sudo, right? But you can refer to FAQ for at least module number 1, how to do that. And I think a similar thing can apply to, I suppose, can apply to this
Yeah.
case.
They're just files, so it sounds like it's an
Yeah.
ownership issue, especially if this is on Linux.
Yeah. Because Linux is more picky when it comes to file ownership, especially when it's root. So on Windows, I don't have this problem. So everything I run inside Docker, I can by default just access. On Mac, maybe it's similar. I don't know. Okay, I guess this one is resolved, and if this thing comes up again, perhaps we would need to have a more detailed instruction on how to actually solve this problem. But yeah, just let us know in Slack or maybe in this live chat. I guess it's not a question. Yeah. We, I also share the sentiment. Thanks.
Good to see.
Yeah. And actually, like funny thing, I was you get tagged in LinkedIn post quite a lot, I assume. And
Yes.
I saw some posts where people say I use Mage at work, and now I'm taking the course to be more effective with Mage. So it's really nice to see posts like that. I don't know what for me it's like personally. Oh, cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it's I've spent a lot of time over the last few days, just a ton of feedback from this course, and it's been really rewarding. So it's great to see everybody sharing their projects and sharing what they learned.
Okay. So can you explain high level what the GCP Terraform template is doing? What's the difference from spinning up Mage in a VM using Docker?
Yeah, for sure. So if we take a step back and think about what Terraform is, Terraform is kind of like infrastructure as code. So if you want to deploy something to a cloud service, you're probably going to have to go in and create a bunch of different resources, right? You might need to create a database, and then you might need to create a container, and then you might need to create a network for the container to communicate with the database. And you're doing all these things in maybe a UI on GCP. Or whatever. And that can get difficult to manage because it's not defined as code, it's not version. There's no way to take it all down or stand it all up at the same time. And so Terraform is really just a tool that lets you, number one, version control your cloud infrastructure. And number two, deploy a bunch of resources simultaneously. And so that's kind of what the Terraform template for Mage is doing. It's deploying all of these different things into GCP and then like connecting them together. And so if you go through that Terraform script, you can kind of see, and you start trying to pick through the Terraform syntax, you can see what we're doing in like defining a network or defining services and permissions. It's really just standing things up behind the scenes so that you don't have to do it yourself. Because the alternative would be to, right, just deploy the Docker image, but then you have to set up all these auxiliary services, persist the storage, and like configure it manually. Spinning Mage up in a virtual machine using Docker, that's kind of a different method of deployment. It doesn't come with some of the benefits of doing it on GCP because there's a bunch of different kind of auxiliary services we're utilizing to make it kind of more like a production ready deployment, if that answers your question.
Because like if you do it this way, if you just do Docker Compose up on a virtual machine, then what happens if it gets down for some reasons, out of memory or whatever? Like can be a million reasons why it goes down. There is nothing that constantly makes a health check to make sure that this thing is up and running, right? So there are a million things that Google Cloud is doing when you deploy it with Cloud Run or something else that you would need to write all these checks yourself on a VM, right? You don't want to do that. That's why it's better to rely on these container orchestration tools like maybe you heard like Kubernetes. Like they do these things out of the box, right? Then you don't need to worry about performing these things yourself.
For sure.
Okay. Can you show us how to debug in Mage, both in the tool and via Visual Studio Code? I suppose it's like when you put a breakpoint in your code and then press F5 or F9, whatever, many, many times to see what's happening.
Yeah, we can talk about this. I'll pull up a
Should they
demo
stop
pipeline quickly.
sharing?
What's up?
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Just give me 1 second here, and we can. I'll pull up a good pipeline to walk through.
Which makes me wonder, like, I don't remember last time I actually needed to debug something with this way of debugging. Like, I would typically write a test that reproduces the issue and then try to
Yeah.
test.
So I have a sample pipeline up here. We'll load some data. Like when we think about debugging, right? If you're thinking about like breakpoints or like software development, things are a little bit different in Mage, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here, right? So like normally we'd write like an assertion or a test for whatever we're doing here. So you can see, for example, in our transformer, we're testing the output. So maybe you want to make sure when you talk about debugging something, well, like what's breaking, right? There are a couple ways to do that. We can either write a test to write some assertion on the data frame. So we could say like, oh, hey, let's assert that df dot columns, right? Like if we did like a len converted this to a list is equal to some number. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we'll say 7, right? And now when we run this, well, this is why you shouldn't do stuff like this live, but I'm doing it anyway. So right, 0 out of 1 test pass. So like this is in a sense a way of debugging. Hey, we're actually not getting 7 columns back, so I couldn't count. But you can debug this way. Another thing that Mage has here is the idea of like a scratch pad. So if we add in like a scratch pad block into our pipeline, this is just pure Python when we add in the scratch pad blocks. And so they're exactly used for experimentation and testing out code. So if you're building something you want to debug as you're going, you pull in a scratch pad here. It's pre-populated with loading this data set, and you can kind of tinker as if you were in a Jupyter notebook. So I'd say that's another way of debugging things. So we have assertions, we have scratch pads, and then, I think as you're building out code inside of the data loader, you can just play around with it because of the sort of modular nature of Mage. Running this block is only going to execute the code that lives inside of this block. So debugging doesn't look so much like using breakpoints in software development. It looks a lot more like writing code in a Jupyter notebook. So if I was going to think about, well, what does the debugging experience in Mage look like? I would say it looks a lot closer to the debugging experience in a Jupyter notebook. Do you think that answers the question there, Alexi?
I think it does, yeah. Like maybe I misunderstood the question like about this break. When it comes to debugging, this is the first thing that comes to my mind
That's what
because
I
I'm
thought of first too, right? Yeah,
yeah.
no, I'm the same way. But I think Mage, it just requires a little bit of a mindset shift of like, okay, like if this doesn't work, right? Well, then like we can drop open a scratch pad or we can create some assertions to test things out. And that's usually how we approach it.
And I think this is running in your local environment, so maybe you can show us how this looks in your file system, and then how we
Yeah,
can open it with Visual Studio Code, and how we can also commit these files to Git.
for sure. So I'm only sharing this window right now. I'll share I'll open up VS Code here. So I think one thing I'll show before I open VS Code up, right? I think it's important to understand what's going on. So if I look at the terminal, because this is like just a file system, right? Home/src is sort of the base path for all the stuff we do in Mage, and I'll make this a little bit bigger for y'all. So this is the base path, and right, if I do like a ls, you can see what the sort of folder structure looks like here. Like you can see our Docker file. The name of this project is Mage Test env. That's just the default name I gave for this thing, but it exactly mirrors our sort of all files folder here. So everything that we're doing is just happening in a in sort of a folder. And so I'm going to open the same thing in VS Code, and then I'll share that with y'all as well. So now we're looking at VS Code, and again, I'll make this a little bit bigger. And this should look exactly like the same thing we just saw, right? So excluding Mage data, excluding some of like hidden folders, we have exactly the same file structure, right? Callbacks, charts, conditionals, data exporters that we'd expect from our Mage projects. And so, if you want to edit this code, if I want to look at one of my data loaders, I can go in here, find the name of the data loader. I think we're just doing load Titanic, open it up, and we're going to see like, oh, hey, assert len list df columns equals 7. That's what I just typed in, right? And it exists in a Python file because all Mage is doing on the back end is creating these files, these Python files, SQL files, whatever, that we can then access later. So, like if you wanted to, if you had a really, if you had a development environment you really preferred, or you had extensions that you really liked in VS Code, you could totally write Python in here, right? Like, um, do whatever, save it, run linting on this, run formatting on this, and it's going to flow through to whatever exists in the Mage environment, assuming that, like Alexi mentioned, you have your permissions squared away with Linux or whatever system you're using. And then in the same way, right, like for this repo, I just ran git init, and so I have this in a GitHub repo. And because anything we do in the UI persists here. Anything we do here persists to the UI. Well, then you can just, anytime you make a change, you can do like a git add dot, right? Git commit -m, like add test or whatever, and then push it to some remote repo the same way you would with any other project. And the one thing that I'll call out is that, I configured this as I mentioned in this repo. So you just have to be aware that if you're going to be committing things, you need to make sure you have a git ignore file, and that git ignore file ignores any files that have sensitive data in them. I got one user reached out to me. I think it was Friday, and I think they might have pushed their GCP token to our service account to a public GitHub repo, and they were a little flustered from that, which I have totally done, right? I've done that working at a big company. I pushed credentials to repos and like learned the very hard way that it's not a fun experience for everybody involved, right? So like stuff happens, but that's really why it's important to have this git ignore file and make sure that's configured by default to exclude anything that could even look like a token or security credentials.
And it's actually very good that Google Cloud found out about that earlier than anyone else, right? And then they blocked the key, because otherwise you might end up receiving a huge bill when somebody is mining Bitcoin on your account.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I guess I'll again share my screen. And we covered that. So when we want to delete blocks and pipelines, and the block reports that this is in use by 3 pipelines, how do we find out which pipelines?
Ella, that's a great question. So currently that's not a feature in the UI. This is actually a feature request, and that's why we've heard this before. It's a really good one. Like, hey, I want to know what pipelines are using these blocks. Now there is a way to do that in VS Code. So I'll share my screen again. Sorry, Alexi, Alexi, to make you jump back and forth.
Wondering, we should jump back and forth, or I just ask your questions and then you keep sharing your screen. Maybe it's easier.
Yeah, that works too. And I also have I have the screen open here on my left, so like I could drive if that works too. But
Question slide, right?
yeah. So again, because everything is defined as code, like you can poke around and find some pretty cool stuff in this like folder structure. So if you go into pipelines, right? I think we were looking at demo load Titanic. The metadata.yaml file is actually going to define everything about the pipeline. And when I say everything about the pipeline, I mean all the blocks and what they're connected to. So, right, it's going to show me the downstream blocks. Like for this block, which is called load Titanic, you just kind of have to understand what we're saying here. So UUID is the name of the block. Or it should be the same as the name of the block. In most cases, it's like a cleaned name of the block. But what we're saying here in this metadata.yaml file is this is the definition of the pipeline. And so you could say, oh, well, in this project, I want to find every pipeline that uses the block load Titanic. Well, if you do a search in VS Code, we can see it's only in one pipeline, right? And so currently we don't have that functionality available in the UI. But what I'm saying is that, if you go into Mage and you go into your pipeline, you look at the metadata.yaml file, you find the name of the block. So that might be like fill in missing values, right? That's going to be unique to the Mage project. And then you can search for that name. And the files that are returned are going to be the pipelines that block exists in. So we definitely need to work on that feature, but this is how you would accomplish that today. And so, yeah, like I said, I can
Yeah, maybe
drive here.
so I'm still useful. What I can do is I just can read questions and then
Okay,
we
okay,
can.
cool. Sounds good.
Yeah. So the next question that we have is about the 2.2.7 section, which is deployment. And this question is, show us please what you do for config in that section.
Okay, I'll pull up the homework quickly. Or rather just the course GitHub. So I guess there are a couple things for config. I think I talked about well, we'll see what I have here in the file. Okay.
So I saw in the chat that there was a discussion of what should be edited. So I think there is in our FAQ there is something about that too.
Yeah, so for configuration here, the things that you're going to need to do are install Terraform, install the Google Cloud CLI, and then navigate to the Terraform templates and git clone those into a directory. I talk a bit about the deployment prerequisites and the Google Cloud permissions that you'll use. So I guess if there's maybe more of like a targeted, like what are there specific points in the configuration process that users are having trouble with?
And I would suggest also check FAQ. So there are already a few records about that. Like when you have some errors, how you can deal with this. Like for example, there is a record. The question is GCP load balancer problem, security policies code. If you have something like that, then there is a solution to that. So yeah, please check the FAQ. Hopefully that helps. Okay. Do you maybe if I share my screen? So this is a FAQ, and there is a lot of related questions. We probably need to format it a little bit, but I can see that this one, and deploying Mage to GCP. Yeah, check this out. And I probably need to go through this and clean it a little bit too, because it gets a bit messy. Okay. Question from Conrad. Will deployment of streaming pipelines look more or less similar to what we did with Batch? Thanks for the example of deployment with Terraform on GCP. I am not sure if it's a question for me, probably not for Matt, because we don't talk about streaming in Mage, right? But it can do streaming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's a good question. Development of streaming pipelines is a little bit more straightforward actually than batch because like the way that you can add blocks are a little it's slightly limited. It's a little bit more constrained. It's kind of like, what's your source? Here's a light transformation you can do, and then here's a destination. I would say, if you want to see what streaming pipelines and Mage look like, you should go in and create a streaming pipeline. I mean, we can talk about it. I mean, that's what this session's for, right? I could share my screen and show you what the streaming sort of like UI looks like.
Yeah, we have time. Let's do that.
Yeah, so this is the pipelines overview page. I talk about it in the course. But if we create new, this is create a new pipeline. We have our options. So standard, batch, that's what we talk about in this course. Data integration is something more like Fivetran or Airbyte. And then streaming is kind of what the question's about. So I create the streaming pipeline, pretty similar overview, but you'll notice that the data loader blocks are limited to streaming sources. So, if you want to stream from like a Google Cloud PubSub topic, just same UI, but you can see that number one, this isn't Python. This is just a configuration file because, we have our streaming source. We just need to kind of define what that configuration looks like. So it's kind of a bit more narrow, but you can still add a Python transformer block. For example, if we have PubSub events coming in, we can perform any transformations we want in Python. And then we can do a data exporter for the streaming data. And note that we can actually export streaming data to non-streaming sources. So that's pretty cool, right? Like If we wanted to stream data to DuckDB, if we wanted to stream data to like a Postgres, we can do all of that in Mage. So it looks similar, but I would say like streaming is a little bit more complex. Like you have to be able to configure and connect to a pub subtopic. I actually have a demo repo that talks a little bit more about a streaming use case. I'll pull that up and share that in the chat once I'm done here. But hopefully this is kind of a quick overview of the streaming UI for you.
And the question was about deployment. So I assume when it comes to deployment of Mage to Google Cloud Platform, it's actually the same deployment, right? So you deploy the same in the same way, right?
Exactly. There's nothing different. Yeah, so deployment looks identical, yes.
Mm-hmm. And if the question was actually referring to module 6, where we talk about streaming, we don't talk about Mage there, we talk about Kafka. Yeah, so that's different. I don't think we provide Terraform template for deploying that, but you can check past courses from students, past projects from students from the previous courses. Some of them did that, and they used PySpark streaming or Flink, and as a part of the projects, they also configured Terraform. So
I like that.
Yeah.
And so what I'll share here, I'll drop this link in the chat. And Alexa, you can do whatever you want with that. So this is just, it's like a streaming environment, but it's all local. So it all exists inside of a dev container, and it spins up basically a container and then like a mock Kafka topic that takes a JSON file and just plays streaming messages inside the container. And so Mage is configured to connect to that topic, and you can get an example of like reading in streaming data and then writing it to a Postgres data source entirely locally without having to deploy anything if you want to see how that works and play with it a bit.
Okay, so what I just did is I sent this link to the live chat, and I also put it to the description for those who watch it later in replay. So if you watch it later in replay, just go below the video in the description, you'll find the link to that Matt just shared. Okay, so what are the differences, advantages, and disadvantages between Mage and Kafka?
Yeah, so I think this is a bit of a let's unpack this a bit. First, Kafka is a streaming platform, is a streaming framework, and Mage is a data orchestrator. So if you look at something like Kafka, it's designed to handle and process streaming data. So that's fundamentally different from what Mage does. However, Mage can integrate with Kafka in the sense that it can read messages from Kafka and then write them to destinations. So I think here we need to think about the problem we're trying to solve and the tool we're looking for to solve it, right? If you're a data engineer and maybe you know a bunch of Java and somebody comes to you and says, I need you to build this streaming system that's capable of handling, X load at X latency that can solve this business problem. Like you're probably looking for Kafka, or you're looking for Flink, or you're looking for a like streaming framework to solve your problem. But if you're a data engineer and you're thinking, how do I take data from all these different sources, execute pipelines according to some cadence, to some schedule, transform that data and write it to a destination? Well, that's maybe where you're looking for something like Mage or something like Airflow or something like, Prefect or Dagster. There are all these solutions. But I think the first step here would be understanding when to use an orchestrator and when to use a streaming framework. And for that, I would say we can look at the first lesson in this course, which is like, what is data orchestration?
Would you say that the way Mage works with streaming sources is it kind of is executed in batch mode and then checks, okay, what I have not processed yet, it processes it and then puts to destination? Or it's actually up and running all the time and listening to topics and consuming messages as they appear?
Yeah, I believe it does actually work in sort of like a micro batch mode, right? Where it's like waiting, it'll collect messages. You can configure how many messages it collects in those micro batches. Like that's a configurable aspect of Mage. It's not like a true streaming platform in the sense that it's going to collect message by message and then write them to a destination. That's actually really hard to do. And if you need to do something like that with like sub 10 millisecond latency, I would say check out like Apache Flink or like, something that's really powerful, because our streaming sources is kind of tailored more towards batch and maybe not suitable for like cases where you need real-time data to like consumers, right? So Yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
I think the use case here would be, okay, there are already streams in Kafka or whatever you use, Kinesis, and these streams are used by apps, by different applications, but we as data engineers want to also tap into these streams and save data for analytics, right? And for analytics, we don't often need like sub-millisecond real-time data. It's okay if there's like, I don't know, 5 minutes delay. That we know that for us data engineers, it's important that the data gets there within a reasonable time frame, right? And then like this data becomes available for analysts, data scientists, whoever needs that, right? So the use cases would be different. Like so here we don't talk about like super fast processing. It's just reasonable for us to, and then simple enough for us to just get data from point A, from source A to source B.
I totally, yeah, that's spot on, right? We're not here to provide sub-millisecond latency. That's a really hard problem to solve. But if you just need relatively timely data, we make it super easy to do that.
And then I would also think about Mage and Kafka in the same way as Mage and Postgres, right? So one is more like where the data is, and the other is the thing that processes it. And so then, yeah, so Kafka is more like a storage, except that it's like made for streaming, whatever. But at the end, it's still like something where the data arrives and where the data can be read from. And then Mage is what is doing the thing, what is reading the data or putting the data back.
I like that. Yep.
Okay. Question from Ronald. Deploying Mage with Cloud Run. Given that GCP Cloud Run has a 60 minutes timeout, what would you suggest when handling pipeline that might run over the limit?
That's interesting. I didn't realize Cloud Run has a 60-minute timeout. Oh, yeah, I'm just looking this up right now. Setting the request timeout. So I think what I'm seeing is that the timeout is specifically for requests, as in you know it might take longer than 60 minutes to fetch a request. If that's the case, I would say see if you can chunk that data up somehow to maybe fetch data, you know, in chunks that take less than 60 minutes. I don't think that there's a huge solution other than that because, you know, the speed, the internet speed's pretty high. And so if you're requesting data that takes longer than 60 minutes to download from a deployed Cloud Run instance, that's a lot of data. And I think you should be batching that up or chunking it into smaller pieces somehow. I think generally the approach would be to leverage chunking logic according to what you're trying to do and parallelization to some degree to try and reduce that time. But from what I can see, the 60-minute limit is specifically for requests. So I would consider fetching data in a way that you're incrementally getting that data instead of loading it all at once.
There is a comment I see in live chat from Dmitry. I think in 2.2.7 the recording started late, so the section where Matt might have done all the stuff is actually missing. So we probably need to check that.
Okay, happy to take a look.
Yeah. So perhaps that's why, like, I saw this in in Slack that students needed to figure out some of the stuff. Yeah. Okay. So moving on, more like a suggestion from Dmitry. I think it's the same Dmitry. Yeah. To have docs on general structure of folders and files that Mage creates and manages. This is what you showed in VS Code, this folder structure that Mage creates. Perhaps you have it in docs somewhere, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull that up right now. I'll see if I can grab a link for you, or just share my screen. Yeah, here you go. So design abstractions project structure. You can see it on the side there. We talk about a sample project, a sample folder structure. We talk about where blocks live and how pipelines are stored, what the utils folder is for, what the extension folder is for, how projects are organized, project data. how to change the name of your project, what to do if you're not using Docker, and that sort of thing. So hopefully this is helpful for you.
I think we're becoming quite effective at changing who's sharing the screen.
Yeah, we really we're figuring it out. So
Uh, I haven't started the course. Is there still time? Yeah, you can start at any point. When we execute blocks with all upstream, the default is the outputs are all in the current block instead of the actual block. Is this configurable setting?
yeah, that's actually not a configurable setting, but I think that that's something we could look into. I'll take a note of that and ask the engineering team. If you feel inclined, you could open up a feature request on GitHub or drop into our Slack and ask a feature request.
Can you show us how to do that?
Absolutely. Share my screen one more time. So if you go to our GitHub repo, this is where all the code goes. The entire project's open source, if I haven't mentioned that yet. So you can see like David is making some updates today. We have a nice little README here, but it's actually kind of under issues. So if you click issues, you'll see new issue. But clicking new issue is going to get you bug report, a custom issue template, or a feature request. So we start with a feature request. You can add a title. You can talk about your feature request, the solution you want, alternatives you consider, additional context, that sort of thing. And you can also add labels here, which should be a feature request. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So if you want to do that, that would be awesome. Or I'll share Slack instead. We can talk about what that looks like.
There is a link in the course repo, right, to your Slack.
There is definitely a link to the course repo, and I can share that here as well. But if we go into the Mage Slack, there is a channel for feature requests. You can see some people requesting features all the time. So feel free to drop feature requests on either of those places.
What would you suggest, like, which is the preferred way? Because like in GitHub, if I'm not careful enough, I might accidentally create a duplicate. Should I go directly to GitHub, or maybe I first go to Slack and then ask there?
Well, yeah, I mean, and usually, right, if you're creating a feature you don't know that exists yet, so you might be like searching the docs, searching Slack. So yeah, do some poking to see if somebody else already requested it or if it already exists. I think ideally just go to the Slack channel and say, hey, could you work on this thing? And then that way, if we're already working on it, we can add that to the backlog. And we might even say, hey, this seems like a really good idea. Could you add this to GitHub? So yeah, maybe Slack is a good place to start.
What about advanced blocks in Mage? We couldn't see the video. Yeah, I think we actually talked about, so Matt had a video, but it was not, it was slightly different from the course. So what we ended up was including the links to the documentation, right?
Yep, that's right. And so, yeah, if you want to talk about advanced blocks, there's a ton of stuff on the documentation. Just go to docs.mage.ai. There are a bunch of tips and tricks videos, ways to like get started with some of those like advanced blocks. Or drop in the Slack. You can ask us questions there. Happy to help you out.
And if you want to see actually the videos I mentioned, and these videos, they are not talking about the course data, they are just talking about these blocks in general. If this is interesting for you, also mention, and we should be able to share this video too, right?
For sure, yes.
Yeah. Can Mage handle the processing of files larger than instance size? Or is it recommended to use Mage for orchestration and connect it with tools like dbt Spark? I guess it means if I run it on VM and I have only 8 gigs of memory, it means that I can only process things that fit in this memory, right?
Technically, yes. But,
file that is larger.
Yeah, you'll run out of memory, right? Because we can't store all, if Mage is trying to process a file and store it in memory, it can't do that if the file is larger than the memory. So effectively, what you need to do is think about maybe smart ways to chunk that logic or to, chunk those files up, write them incrementally, write them in parallel to handle those larger data sources. But, if you're dealing with a file that's 8 gigs, it's probably not a great idea to just be like, get me the entire file and store it in memory, that's going to be kind of slow. So, okay, well, maybe we could fetch the file, write it, or process it incrementally somehow. That would be my recommendation.
But can we invoke a Spark job from Mage? We can, right?
Absolutely. We do have a Spark interface.
No. So then, like, I guess if you have a Spark cluster, then yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
And I mean, yeah, if you're I guess, that answer came from the perspective of like, oh, you just have this in Docker on your computer or something, right? If you're running this on Kubernetes, yeah, we'll be able to scale up and down. You can scale horizontally or vertically and be able to accommodate those larger sizes. So
Mhm. How does that actually work? Like for each of the pipelines, it would request a container of certain size, right? Or
yeah, I think you can actually request. It might be by pipeline. I think you can configure it by block. I need to check like, oh, for each block it's executing in a different. I need to check on that, but I think I'm pretty sure the default is just, yeah, a container per pipeline.
so then if you're on Kubernetes, then you can say like for this block I want to have 16 gigs of RAM, right?
Yeah.
What is the recommended way of storing the variables between block executions? Like define something based on the first batch of data and then use it in future blocks.
Yeah, definitely check out the video on in 2.2.6 parameterized execution. So in that video, we're going to talk about pipeline level variables and what that looks like. And I'm happy to walk through other examples as well. But in that video, we talk about how to create and store variables in your pipeline. So what you could do in the first block is fetch something, store it as a variable, right? And then re-access it in a later block and check against that variable. And so that should allow you to accomplish what you're asking.
Like I'm looking while you were talking, I was looking at this block. Like it looks complete, right? Do you
Yeah,
think anything is missing here?
I think some folks had issues with configuring Terraform. I would start with install but I'm relatively certain that that spans the entirety of what you need to do. I'll just need to take a look at the messages and see what's up.
Yeah. Okay. What are the recommended specs to run Mage? I found it very slow with 8 gigs of RAM. Was a lot better with 18 gigs of RAM. Of course, like when you run it on a virtual machine, you don't have Chrome running there and eating up all the memory. Like I guess it would be faster even with 8 gigs on AVM. But yeah, I'm shutting up, please, Matt. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I ran a lot of tests with for this course with Mage at like 4 gigs, honestly. So like it worked for everything I was trying to do. I think it depends largely on like what you're trying to do and what your machine looks like and all of these other factors, right? So if you're running it with 8 gigs locally and then you're loading in a 6 gig data set, yeah, like it might be a little slow, right? So think about what your use case looks like. Their recommended specs, I'd say anything north of 4 gigs should be fine for like smaller data engineering workloads. If you're trying to do something with large volumes of of data, you might need a little bit more, but 8 to 16 gigs should be fine for most use cases.
So there are discussions on Reddit in the data engineering subreddit that Mage isn't production ready. What do you think about that? Like maybe, I guess when we talk about production ready, it could be different definitions, right? So maybe for some workloads, Mage isn't usable and you need to use something else. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, people talk about like a solution or a perfect solution, and that like it doesn't really exist in the real world. So something that works for me might not work for you. What works for you might not work for me, right? And so I think that's kind of at play here, right? If you want to use Mage, I would say evaluate it, see if it works for you. And in that sense, it might be production ready in your definition. That being said, it is pre V1 software. So, this is not Airflow, right? Airflow has been around for 10 years. Mage has been around for 2 years, right? And if you go to, yeah, it's Mage AI/Mage AI. I think we're on V.9.62, right? So you can see we're not quite yet at V1. That should, if you're an engineer and you're evaluating software, usually you can look at the versioning, you can look at how old the tool is, or you can look at any number of things to determine what the like level of risk or instability is. So Mage isn't as mature as something like Airflow, but I think for a number of use cases, it's definitely production ready. We have a lot of customers or a lot of users using Mage in production. So for them, it's production ready. And that's how I'd answer that.
How would I determine, let's say I am choosing an orchestrator for my organization, and then I am evaluating, I don't know, Airflow, Duckster, Perfect, Mage, right? Like there are many of them. And I see that, okay, Mage is pre-EV1, but like how big of a deal it is, like how do I actually, what kind of criteria can I use to find the right orchestrator for me?
Yeah. So again, I think it comes down to what works for you and what's important for you. So if you're a data engineer and you have this decision, you get to choose which tool you implement. Number one, that's a fun decision, right? Like spend a lot of time, create a spreadsheet, do pros and cons for each tool. I would start with what are the problems that you need to solve, right? Like you have mandates as an engineer, things you need to build, things you need to deliver to people. And these tools are going to be better for some of those, maybe worse for others. Every tool has its pros and cons. And so start from what you need, start from what your ideal solution looks like, think through that. And then when you go into the evaluation phase for these tools, right? I made it as easy as possible to get started with Mage. If you go to our getting started page, it's like git clone Docker compose up, and you can play with Mage. You can see, hey, is this the right tool for me? Do the same thing with Dagster, do the same thing with Airflow. Yeah, see how easy it is to get started with Airflow, and then we can talk about that later. But do it with Prefect, everything. Like evaluate all the tools, spend a couple hours poking around with them because if this is something you're going to deploy and then spend uh every day working in, it's important to spend that time to evaluate it. So in short, think about what you want, think about what the ideal solution looks like, and then go through a number of tools. You know, I think going into like the Slack communities and seeing what response times look like for various tools and how easy it is to get support for various things is important. Go to the GitHub, see how often commits are being pushed to the repo, right? Like if you go to stuff on more mature tools, it actually takes longer to get updates to that software. Now, on earlier tools like Mage, right, updates go in very quickly, but that's because it's a little bit younger and there are pros and cons to all of that. So there are a bunch of dimensions you can think through as an engineer of like, how mature should the solution be? And, is this something that I need to consider?
Funny you should mention the easiness to get started with Airflow. Because I remember, so for the first edition of the data engineering course of this course, we used Airflow. And I think it was the biggest source of issues, even after. Right now, the biggest source of issues is the module number 1 with Docker, but before it was Airflow, right? So you can imagine how. Yeah, of course, like we had this Docker Compose, and it was supposed to be as easy as Docker Compose up, but yeah. Anyways,
And don't get me wrong, Airflow is a great piece of software. A lot of people use it and it's a great tool. So it's just geared towards a very different crowd. So every tool has its use case.
and I think if we talk about market share, it's probably still the most popular one, right? Even though
100%.
it's losing to some of other more modern tools, it's still the most popular one.
Absolutely.
I was wondering what this DY, XY, DD mean.
Those are the engineers that committed the code. So DY is David Yang, awesome
I,
engineer. He lives in San Francisco. TD is Tommy Dang, uh, from Santa Clara, California. XY is Xiao Yu, another great engineer, our CTO. So that's that's what those mean.
I see, okay. It's like not enough to see the picture here, right?
Yeah, that's just our convention. So
Okay. How to load the green taxi data frame. It's not loaded in data time format, even if I parse it. I don't know if it's specific to Mage.
that's a homework question. We can talk about it if you want.
No, let's wait because we extended the homework
Okay.
for now. It's still Thursday, so let's talk about this later.
Yeah, I would just say take a look at the video where we load a similar data set. There's some date time formatting. It should be similar to that.
Mhm. Which typical transformations are done with CSVs in the industry? Such a broad question. Do you want to?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can do any data transformation with CSVs. I would say a good starting point is a library like Pandas. That's kind of the industry standard. Some newer libraries are like Polars, a little bit faster with a Rust backend. And DuckDB has a read CSV function. And so once you read a CSV into a data frame or into a table, you can do any data transformation that you want to do with it. And that might look like aggregating, it might look like filtering or slicing that table. You could join it on other data. You could supplement it with additional data. Pretty much the sky is the limit. So
it's like you can do with CSV anything you can do with any other data format, I guess.
exactly.
What about using Mage for MLOps workflows?
Yeah, this is not, I wouldn't say the Mage wasn't created to solve ML ops problems. It's more of an orchestrator transformer. I think that you could use it for those things, but it might not be I think the optimal solution would be to use Mage for orchestration and transformation, and then something else to manage the model training process, because I think that there are a number of other considerations that come along with that. I am not an MLOps practitioner. I'm not a machine learning engineer, so I don't know the specifics of that. I would do some research into that space to understand the best solutions there. But Alexi might know more about me, more than I do.
So what I would say is, as with any other workflow orchestration, you can use that for training your model. And usually the way it works, let's say for Airflow, you wouldn't necessarily train a model inside Airflow. Typically for machine learning, to train a machine learning model, especially if we talk about deep learning, you need some specialized hardware requirements, like a GPU or maybe a powerful machine with like many CPU cores, right? So typically what you do is the orchestrator delegates the execution to something else. Can be SageMaker, can be Kubernetes, can be whatever. So you just invoke it from the workflow orchestrator. You say, I want to execute these jobs with these parameters, and then it's executed somewhere, and then the training is done. So it's a part of your pipeline. So first you prepare the data with Mage, for example, right? And then at some point the data is ready for the model to be trained on, and then you delegate the actual execution to some compute environment. So, yeah. I have a column called season, which has values 2021 and 2021, 2022. Should it pre-process them in ingestion or when creating facts and dimension tables?
I love it. Very specific data engineering question. I think there is no right answer, of course, and it depends on what your architecture looks like. So if your pattern is take everything and write it to cloud storage, you should probably just write it to cloud storage and then pre-process later. Maybe you're using like a medallion architecture, which is just kind of like staging tables in cloud storage. And if you're doing that, if you don't know what a medallion architecture is, check out what a medallion architecture is, because that's a pattern for transforming data, cleaning data in the cloud. It's a term coined by Databricks, so it is a bit, like you're going to see their marketing stuff, but it's still useful for thinking about how to store data in a cloud environment. It basically just entails storing data in bronze tables, which are just like raw data, cleaning them slightly, storing it in silver tables, right? Like cleanse there, you can see on the screen, and then storing data in gold tables, which is like curated, right? And so you can do this in Delta Lake, which is like what Databricks would want you to do. You could do it in Iceberg, or you could do it in a data warehouse. So maybe you write data to like in Postgres, raw transactions, and then you have staged transactions or curated transactions, and then you have clean transactions. So when you're thinking about your architecture and how you want your sort of data engineering assets to look, or what you want that entire lifecycle to look like, I would say staging is definitely a best practice, but there is no one right way to stage data and transform it. But the important thing is to be consistent. So if you have raw tables, they should contain raw data. If you have staging tables, you should do the same transformations in all the staging tables and et cetera for the clean tables. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. So I realized that we only have 2 minutes left. So the next question on materials on Kedro. So Kedro is more for creating machine learning pipelines, so we don't really talk about that here. And then let's take this one from Ronald. what's the role of load balancer in the settings for the Terraform template?
Yeah, so I mean, load balancer, I would definitely say like look up what a load balancer is if you want to learn more about load balancing, but it just distributes a set of tasks over resources. So it handles like fluctuations in the network, fluctuations in like the API strain to the app. So load balancing, if you have a bunch of requests or you're doing a bunch of different computing, it'll like distribute that so that Mage can function consistently and without interruption. For more on that, I would say jump into the Slack, check out like our engine. Like I would have to talk to the engineers, but you can always ask the engineers that in our Slack channel.
And I think maybe it's even a requirement for, I'm not sure about Google Cloud Run, but for example, if I want to deploy something to ECS, which is Elastic Container Storage in AWS, they really like the Elastic port. It's everywhere. So if you want to deploy something there and it's a web application, I think you might even have to use a load balancer. If you don't use that, then like you cannot really access your web server from outside the outside world. That was my experience with ECS. I'm not like super professional there, so it could be also that Cloud Run needs you to do that. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks, Matt, a lot for joining us today, for talking about Mage, for talking about also other things like how to use this medallion architecture. Yeah, it was fun. I hope everyone liked that. So don't forget to like the video, tell your friends about that, all the usual stuff. And you still have a few days to have more fun with Mage till Thursday. So enjoy this time.
Awesome. It was a lot of fun. I'm glad I was able to help everyone out, and I'll see you in Slack and see you around.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Bye, Matt.